In this video, we're going to look at parallelograms, and we're going to look at the properties of parallelograms. And so let's just start out by looking at, well, the shape, and then we're going to kind of look at the diagonals and what they do. So the diagonals of a parallelogram are said to be mutually bisecting. And so what that means is they cut each other in half. So if we look at the diagonals here, each diagonal cuts this shape in half. And so let me see if I'm going to move this one out of the way. So this diagonal here, it cuts it into two equal pieces. And if we took this top piece and rotated it, it would fit perfectly in here. And then likewise, this diagonal cuts it in half. Now, this is not what mutually bisecting means, so don't get too confused. But it cuts it in two equal parts as well. So what mutually bisecting means is they cut each other in half. And so that means that this half is the same as this half. And this half is the same as this half. So these lines cut each other in half. That's what mutually bisecting means. The diagonals are not lines of symmetry, however. Even though it makes it into two equal parts, that does not mean that this is symmetric. If you folded it along this line, they would not fold right on top of one another. Okay, and then let's look at the bottom here. The diagonals do cut the parallelogram into two pairs of congruent triangles. So this green triangle is congruent to this green triangle, and this red triangle is congruent to this red triangle. And then if you just use one diagonal, like I had showed you before, it cuts it into two congruent triangles that way. So we'd have this triangle down here would be congruent to, we'll use this one, congruent to the other triangle here. So this one. Those look really, really nice, as you can tell. Okay, so let's look at a few more things. Properties of the angles of the parallelogram. So any angles that are consecutive, that are right next to each other, those are supplementary angles. So that means that they add up to 180. So the angles that are right next to each other, these two, 1 and 2, those are supplementary. Or we could say these angles, 3 and 4, these are supplementary. Or these two angles are supplementary, and so on. So the angles right next to each other are supplementary. And then the angles that are across from each other, like this one and this one, those are congruent. And same thing with these two angles. Those are also congruent. So the angles across from each other are congruent, or the opposite angles are congruent. And then the angles next to each other, or consecutive angles, those are supplementary. All right. And then the opposite sides are congruent. So we talked about angles. Now we're talking about sides. These two sides are congruent, and these two sides are congruent. And then lastly, should go without saying, but in a parallelogram, the opposite sides are also parallel. So let's copy this. The opposite sides aren't just congruent, but they're also parallel. So that means that this side and this side are parallel, and this side and this side are parallel. Okay, so let's look at one example and apply what we learned in this video. So it says given ADE is 67 degrees, ABC is 80 degrees, AEB, and so on. So let's fill this stuff in. I'm going to use blue for the angles. So ADE is 67, so I'm just going to write 67 in here. And what I encourage you to do is pause the video and do the same thing. Copy the shape down and then fill in what we know. ABC is 80, so that means this whole thing here is 80. And then AEB, this angle right here, is 138 degrees. 138. Okay, so let me switch up colors. I'll use red for the sides. So AB is going to be 32 inches. AD is 18 inches. AC is 24 inches. And so this whole thing is 24. And what we learned is that if these are mutually bisecting, that this is going to be cut in half. So half of 24 is 12 and 12. And then BD is 40, so this one along here is 40. Likewise, it would be cut in half, so 20 and 20. That's half of 40. Okay, so let's try answering some of these questions. BC, well, BC is the same as AD, so that's going to be 18. So this is 18 inches. BE, we figured that out. That was half of 40, so that's 20 inches. And DC, the bottom one, is the same as the top, so it's going to be 32 inches. Okay, and let's figure out some angles, and I'll switch over to blue for that one. So angle BCD. Well, this angle down here in this corner, we talked earlier in the video that this angle and this angle are going to be supplementary. The consecutive angles are supplementary. So we've got 80 here, and we need to figure out what this one is so that they add up to 180. So 180 take away 80 is 100. So that means that BCD is 100 degrees. That's 100, not 106. So we're talking about the whole thing, both of these two angles put together. Okay, BEC, that would be this angle right here. I noticed that these two angles, the 138 and the BEC, these form a nice straight line. And lines are, when you cut them with an angle, they're 180 degrees. So we're going to go 180 minus 138 this time. Minus 138, and we get 42. So this angle here is 42 degrees. EDC, so from E to D, oops, to C, that would be this angle. And one of the things we learned in this video is that the opposite angles, so let me use green here, this angle and this angle are congruent. The opposite angles are congruent. So that means this whole angle here is going to be 80. And if we know this part is 67, we need to figure out this part. So we'll go 80 take away 67. And we get 13. So this angle is 13 degrees. And I'll label that on my picture. And lastly, BCE. So BCE is this angle right here. Well, I know, so this might take a little bit of work, and there's multiple ways to figure this out. But what I'm going to do is I know that these two angles across from each other, the 80 and the 80, have to be the same, which means that this thing here is 13 and 67. And that's going to be because these are alternate interior angles. And we'll learn about that in the video 3.3. So if we've got 67 and 42, then this angle means it has to, these three have to add up to 180. In a triangle, the three angles have to add up to 180. So 67 plus 42 is 109. And then we do 180 minus 109 because the three angles have to add up to 180. So we get 71. So this angle here is 71 degrees. All right, hopefully that helps you understand parallelograms.